She was tied to a fence for being too weak, but the silent single dad rancher gave her a home. The midday sun in Dry Willow burned down like judgment. Dust curled from wagon wheels, baking into the cracked earth of the main street. And there, in the middle of it all, Clara Wynne stood tied by her only arm to the splintered fence outside the general store. She wasn't crying. She never cried in public, not anymore. Her chin was tucked low, hiding half her face beneath wisps of auburn hair, gone brittle from dust and sun. Her left wrist was lashed so tightly the rope bit into old scars, and a faint trail of blood snaked down her forearm, staining the hem of her faded calico sleeve. The right sleeve hung empty. "She's useless. Always has been," someone snorted from the porch of the saloon. "Too weak to light a fire without burning a house down," another chimed in. Laughter rolled through the street like distant thunder. Children whispered behind their mothers' skirts, "That's the broken girl, the one with one arm." Clara said nothing. She hadn't spoken since they dragged her here at dawn. Her voice, like so many things in her life, had long been deemed unnecessary. A judge of the town, a store owner with more power than sense, had declared her a danger after a small fire broke out in the shed she'd been renting. It had caught the edge of another building. No one was hurt, but it was enough. "She's more trouble than she's worth," he'd ruled. "Reckless, incompetent. Best send her to the work farm, tomorrow." So, they tied her to the fence like a stray animal, a warning to others who didn't pull their weight. Still, Clara didn't cry. Her heart pounded with shame, but it was the familiar kind, the cold, dull ache of being seen but never truly noticed. Since the fire that took her parents and her right arm at age 10, Clara had lived on the outskirts of usefulness, taken in here and there, pitied, then discarded. Her life had become a long string of borrowed roofs and forced apologies. Then came the sound of hooves. A single horse, steady and unhurried, came down the dusty road. A man rode it, tall, square-shouldered, dressed in worn denim and a hide coat bleached by the sun. His beard was salt and pepper, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Levi Langston, the rancher, the war veteran, the man who hadn't been seen smiling in 6 years. He said nothing as he pulled the reins and brought the horse to a stop 10 feet from Clara. The townsfolk quieted, watching. He dismounted in one fluid motion, boots crunching gravel. The only sound was the creak of his saddle and the wind brushing past faded banners above the saloon. Levi stepped toward Clara. His eyes met hers, gray, unreadable, but they held no scorn, no pity, just stillness, like deep water. He pulled a knife from his belt and, without fanfare, sliced the rope binding her wrist. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara staggered, dizzy. Her legs shook. Before she could fall, Levi caught her by the elbow. Not roughly, not gently, just enough. He reached up, took off his hat, and placed it squarely on her head. "Come with me," he said, low and even. Clara blinked. Her mouth parted, but no sound came. Still, her feet moved. One step, then another. She followed him. The crowd parted, confused, murmuring. No one stopped them. No one dared. Levi mounted his horse again, then reached down with one calloused hand to help her up. She hesitated, then grabbed hold. One arm, one chance. As the horse turned westward, kicking up dust behind them, someone finally called out, "You can't just take her." Levi didn't look back. He never did. And Clara, for the first time in years, let herself breathe. The Langston Ranch lay a mile outside town, surrounded by open prairie and a crooked line of cottonwoods that whispered with the wind. Clara had never ridden so far. Her feet ached, her empty stomach churned, and her left arm, her only arm, throbbed from where the rope had dug into it. Levi didn't speak a single word on the way. He rode ahead, straight-backed on his dark horse, as if the world behind him didn't exist. When they reached the ranch, he swung down and tied his horse without a glance back. Clara stood there awkwardly until he turned, pushed the creaking gate open, and gestured with a nod. "Come on." The house was large, but not grand. Plain timber, sun-worn shutters, a tin roof patched in places with scrap metal. Inside, the air smelled like dry wood, oil lamps, and something faintly sweet, stale jam, maybe. Everything was tidy but quiet, too quiet. Cobwebs lingered in the corners of the high ceiling. A clock ticked steadily on the mantel, the only sound in the room. She followed him past the sitting room into the kitchen, where he lit the stove with a practiced flick. Without looking at her, he said, "You'll eat, then work." Before she could respond, footsteps thudded on the stairs. 3 children emerged one by one. The boy was first, tall for 11, with dark hair and eyes like flint. He paused at the bottom step, arms crossed. Caleb. Then came a girl of 8, her auburn hair braided tight, her chin lifted with suspicion. June. Lastly, from behind the worn curtain, a small head peeked out, blonde curls, big eyes. Ruthie, only 4. None of them spoke. They stared. Clara instinctively lowered her gaze. Her shoulders curled inward. She tucked the short sleeve of her dress tighter to hide the stump of her right arm. Her heart pounded. June was the first to break the silence. She stepped forward, narrowed her eyes, and said, cold as iron, "My pa don't need another woman, and we sure don't need a new ma." Levi didn't react. He simply said, "Chores start at dawn." And then he walked away. That night, Clara didn't sleep in the house. She found a pile of dry hay in the old barn, curled herself into it, and pulled her shawl tight around her thin body. The wind howled through the cracks in the wood, and the cold settled into her bones like it belonged there. But she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. The next morning, the rooster crowed before the sun rose. She sat up, her muscles aching, and saw something resting at the barn's entrance. A pair of worn boots, an oversized wool sweater, and a folded note on top. "There's work if you want to eat." No signature, but she knew who had left it. She put the boots on. They were too big, but warm. The sweater smelled faintly of smoke and pine. She tucked her hair under a scarf and limped out into the yard. The chores were brutal. Clara had only one arm, but Levi didn't treat her like she needed mercy. The bucket of water was heavy, but she dragged it from the well. The chicken feed spilled the first time, but she scooped it again, kneeling to keep her balance. Cleaning the stable was nearly impossible. She wrapped the broom handle in leather, tied it to her wrist with a strip of cloth, and learned to swing with her left shoulder and hips. No one helped, but no one stopped her, either. At midday, she collapsed under the shade of an old cottonwood. Dirt streaked her face. Her legs trembled from fatigue, but she had done it. Levi passed by, glanced at the stalls, now cleaned and dry. He didn't praise her. He didn't smile, but he tossed her an apple from his saddlebag and said, "More tomorrow." And for Clara Wynne, the broken girl, that was enough. Clara woke before the sun, her breath fogging in the chill air, as she pulled on the oversized sweater and laced up her boots. The barn creaked with the shifting weight of animals. She took a deep breath, stepped into the day, and began. The wooden bucket was heavier than it looked. With only her left hand, Clara tried to balance it against her hip, but her grip slipped, and water splashed down her legs. Her fingers burned from the cold. Chickens scattered at the noise, flapping and clucking. She pressed her lips together, picked up the bucket again, and tried once more. It was like this for everything, halved, improvised, made slower by her missing arm. The rope she'd tried to tie around a fence post came undone twice before she leaned into the knot, gripping one end between her teeth, using her knees and shoulder. It held, barely. She fed the horses next. One of them shied away when she approached, startled perhaps by her uneven silhouette. Clara whispered gently, extending a single handful of hay. When the horse finally accepted it, she allowed herself the smallest smile. From the porch, Levi watched. He didn't speak. He never did. But each morning, There was something waiting outside the barn door, a hoe placed at the right angle, a bucket filled and left close by, a freshly coiled rope looped lower for easier reach. Not a word of instruction, but every item positioned like someone had thought about her, someone who saw. It wasn't enough for the children. June glared from behind the window. Ruthie peeked at Clara, then ducked away again. Caleb, the oldest, offered no more than a glance before returning to chopping wood. That afternoon, Clara saw June climbing the fence, trying to reach a tangled string of laundry flapping in the wind. Clara was about to look away when June lost her balance. In a flash, the girl tumbled forward. Clara dropped everything and ran. Her feet pounded the frozen dirt. She caught June awkwardly with her arm and chest, her shoulder jarring with the weight. They both hit the ground, Clara cushioning the fall. Pain shot up her side. June froze. For a moment, neither moved. Then June burst into tears, not from pain, but from something else. "I didn't mean to fall," she whispered. "I know," Clara said softly, brushing dirt from the girl's cheek with her sleeve. That evening, at dinner, Clara took her usual seat near the stove, away from the table. She did not expect anything to change, but Levi glanced at her once, then nudged a plate toward the empty chair. Clara hesitated, then walked slowly over and sat down. No one spoke. Midway through the meal, Caleb reached across the table. Without a word, he handed her a thick slice of bread. She looked at it, then at him. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. And somehow, that quiet gesture spoke more than a dozen words ever could. The storm rolled in just past midnight, the kind that howled through the valley and rattled every loose board on the ranch. Clara, who had barely been asleep, heard the groan of wood above the animal pens and the sharp clap of something tearing loose. She sat up on the straw mat inside the barn, heart racing. A piece of the roof had gone, she was sure of it. Clara rushed outside into the freezing rain, barefoot, nightgown whipping in the wind. She saw the canvas tarp that had been tied over the goat pen flapping wildly, the ropes already snapped loose from one corner. Rain lashed her face, and thunder cracked overhead like cannon fire. With no time to lose, she grabbed the spare ropes from the barn wall and bit one end between her teeth. Her bare feet sank into the mud as she climbed up the side railing of the pen. The wind was worse up top, threatening to throw her off before she even got a grip. She used her shoulder and left hand to steady herself, looping the rope around the beam with her mouth and knees. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't fast, but she wasn't going to let the animals suffer because she was too weak. Her fingers were numb. She fumbled. The tarp slapped her in the face as the wind surged again, and she lost her balance. For a moment, she dangled halfway off the edge, held only by her legs hooked around the wooden beam. "Help!" she gasped, just once. Then came boots in the mud, heavy, urgent. Levi. He didn't say a word, just charged forward and reached up with both arms, catching her with ease. His shirt was soaked, his face grim. He lifted her down as if she weighed nothing, then turned his back against the rain, shielding her with his body. She looked up at him, breathing hard, blood dripping from a cut on her forehead. "You fool," he muttered, under his breath, not angry, but something close. He pressed the sleeve of his shirt to her head gently, wiping the blood away with care that startled her more than the storm itself. His hands were rough, strong, but they moved like she was something fragile. "You don't have to prove anything," he said quietly. "Not to them, not to me." Clara's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words dissolved into rain and breath and silence. Levi looked at her another moment, then pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Without waiting, he turned and walked back toward the barn, expecting her to follow, and she did. Later, long after the animals were calm and the wind had died, Clara lay awake on her straw mat, the coat still around her. The bleeding had stopped, but her heart had not. She peeked out the side of the barn, and there he was. Levi sat on the edge of the porch, back against the wooden post, rain dripping off the brim of his hat. His rifle leaned beside him, but he wasn't watching for danger. He was watching the barn, watching her. Clara turned her face into the straw, her cheeks burning not from shame, but something deeper, something warmer. No one had ever come for her before. No one had caught her when she fell. No one had ever touched her with care, without pity. She clutched the coat tighter around herself and finally, let her eyes close, heart still pounding in the rhythm of something she wasn't ready to name. By the time morning light spread across the plains, the rumor had already run its course through every saloon, store, and stable in town. That one-armed girl ran from reform. She's hiding out at Langston's ranch. Clara heard it from the youngest boy who came to trade eggs for salt. The boy's mother had whispered it in church, he said, like a warning. By late afternoon, the dust from wagon wheels and hooves clouded the sky like a storm rolling in. A group of 6 men rode up the long dirt road toward Levi's ranch, all grim-jawed and self-righteous. Their leader, Henry Boyd, half deputy, half land thief, carried a folded notice in his vest pocket, and the kind of voice used to being obeyed. "Langston," he called out, before his boots even hit the ground. Clara was in the barn, chopping straw with her left arm and elbow. She paused when she heard the voices. Her breath caught. Fear, thick and old, climbed her throat like smoke from a fire long past. Levi walked to the front porch, rifle over his shoulder, not raised, just there. Clara stepped out from behind the barn, wiping her hand on her apron, ready to surrender. "I'm here," she said softly. Levi didn't turn. He stepped down from the porch, placing himself between Clara and the men. "She's property of the state now," Henry said. "She was assigned to corrective labor, and she ran. We're taking her in." Clara took a step forward, voice trembling. "It's true. But Levi raised one hand, stopping her. Slowly, silently, he shook his head. Then he spoke, voice even and low, like distant thunder. "She works here. She lives here. That's all that matters." Henry scoffed. "You planning to defy the law, Langston?" Behind them, the screen door creaked open. June stepped out, clutching Ruthie's hand. Caleb came next. The 3 of them stood at the edge of the porch. June broke away and marched down to Clara, who stood frozen in place. Without hesitation, the girl took Clara's hand and said, loud and clear, "She's not going anywhere. This is her home now." Henry blinked, thrown off for a moment. "It's not the business of children." "No," Caleb said, stepping forward. "But it's ours." Ruthie, barely taller than the porch rail, shouted as best she could, "Mama Clara!" Something shifted in the air. The men on horseback glanced at each other. No lawman wanted to drag off a girl protected by 3 children and a war veteran, not with the whole ranch watching. Henry muttered something under his breath and turned his horse. "Let's go." One by one, the riders turned and followed him, dust kicking up behind them. Clara stared at their backs as they disappeared down the road. Her legs were trembling. She hadn't even realized she was holding her breath. Levi turned to her then, his face unreadable. Slowly, he stepped forward, lifted one hand, and placed it gently on her shoulder. No words, just that. Clara's eyes filled with tears. But she didn't cry. For the first time, she didn't look at the ground. She stood straight. And she stayed. The night air had grown cold, sharper than usual. The moon hid behind heavy clouds, and a thick hush settled over the ranch while the stars flickered faintly above. In the smallest room of the house, a single lamp burned low. In that lamp's glow, little Ruthie lay curled under quilts, her tiny body trembling with fever. Clara sat beside her, the only visible limb supporting her vigil. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and the worn shawl she wrapped around her shoulders did little to stop the chill. Her left hand gripped a damp cloth pressed to Ruthie's forehead, the other side of her dress soaked from the effort. The faint hum of the wind outside felt like a distant drum in her chest. Levi paced the floorboards. His boots creaked, his coat dragged as if hugging his knees. He paused at the doorway, looked at Clara, then looked away. The helplessness in his eyes startled Clara. He had been the unflinching rancher, the man of steady duties. But here, now, he was lost. "Doc won't make it for hours," he whispered, voice brittle. "Roads treacherous." Clara didn't respond. She had no words. She only had the task. She reached past a crate and found the leather pouch with dried herbs she'd discovered earlier. Willow bark, feverfew, a few sprigs of mint. She bit a thin leather string with her teeth, tied it around her waist to hold the pouch against her hip. Her knees shook, but she rose and placed the pot upon the small stove. Steam fogged the glass of the lamp. Clara stirred the mixture with a spoon she had fastened to a short handle with her belt, using her chin to steady it when she needed both hands. The smell was strong, bitter, like old medicine and pine needles. Ruthie made a small moan, the fever spiking again. Clara didn't allow herself to think of fear. She thought only of the little voice that had said "Mama" the afternoon before. She whispered to Ruthie, "I've got you. I won't leave you." Hours passed. Clara changed the cloth dozens of times, wiped Ruthie's forehead by pressing her cheek to the child's curls. She hummed, a lullaby her own mother used. The tune cracked when her voice broke. She held Ruthie's small hand in her own, one finger wrapped around 8, whispering the notes until the lamp guttered. Levi came in at one point, silent, carrying a mug of warm tea. He knelt beside her, placed the mug on a stool, and left without a word. The gesture spoke. When Clara dared to look up at his face, she saw the outline of his eyes, red-rimmed, wet but unashamed of tears. By dawn, Clara's muscles burned, her breath shallow. Ruthie lay still. The fire in the hearth burned low. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the window. Clara held Ruthie in her arms, rocking gently. Ruthie's eyelids fluttered, a soft gasp. "Mama Clara." The words were whisper-thin. Clara held tight. Her arm trembled underneath Ruthie's weight, but she didn't shift. Levi appeared then in the doorway, his figure dark against the light. He stood for a moment, looking at them. Then, he stepped forward and lightly placed his hand on Clara's shoulder. His fingers pressed at the fabric of her shawl. He didn't say a word, but his nod carved a promise in the silence. Clara looked at him, blinking back tears. Then she looked down at Ruthie, and for the first time, she felt the fear inside her crack. The sense of being too weak began to melt away. Outside, the wind died down. The day broke. The ranch came alive again. Leah chickens clucked, horses shook out their manes, and the sun warmed the boards of the porch. Clara rose, set Ruthie gently in her crib, and walked past Levi into the kitchen. She washed her left hand in a basin, rinsed the herbs, and placed the pot on the shelf. She allowed herself a small exhale, quiet, not victory, but relief. Levi followed. He fetched a piece of fresh bread and placed it near Clara's bowl. He didn't speak. She didn't look at him. Yet both of them knew. She had done what no one expected. She had saved a child, and in doing so, she saved a part of herself. The morning broke gently, mist still clinging to the fields beyond the Langston ranch. Clara stood by the chicken coop, one-handedly scattering feed. The air held the scent of wet earth and something else, something quieter, heavier. "Clara," Levi's voice called from behind the barn. It was rare for him to say her name aloud, and rarer still for him to ask her presence. She rounded the corner to find him standing in the pale sunlight, holding a small object wrapped in old linen. His expression was unreadable, but his hands looked strangely uncertain, as if they too were unsure of the moment. He handed the bundle to her without a word. She unfolded the cloth carefully and found a small knife, its handle carved from dark wood, inlaid with faded native patterns, worn but beautiful. The blade was still sharp, well-oiled, and cared for. "It belonged to my wife," Levi said finally, his voice low. "Osley, Her father gave it to her. She carried it everywhere, even in the end. Clara looked up, stunned. Levi had never spoken of his wife before. Not to her, not to the children, not in the quiet dinners or long silences they shared. The mention of her name was a tremor in the foundation. He swallowed, eyes on the horizon. I never gave it to anyone, not even June. Clara's throat tightened. She held the knife with both reverence and hesitation, the way one might cradle a wounded bird. The sunlight struck the carvings, bringing them to life, and in that moment she felt the weight of the years he had carried it. The memory, the grief, the silence. I don't know how to say things, he continued, voice rougher now, cracked like old leather. But I know what I see, and what I trust. Clara's lips parted, but she couldn't speak. Her fingers trembled slightly, and the knife caught a single tear that slid down her cheek, leaving a glint of silver before falling to the dirt. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the stoic rancher or the silent protector, but the man beneath the armor. The man who had chosen her from a crowd of scorn, who never demanded a word in return, who showed care and shelter, tools, and long watches through the night. You don't have to say anything, she whispered. He nodded once, a single motion, but it held the weight of everything unspoken between them. Behind them, the wind stirred the grass, the world continuing its quiet rhythm. But for Clara, something shifted, something unbreakable formed in the stillness. It was not the kind of love sung in saloons or written in letters, but the kind forged through scars, silent mornings, and the slow rebuilding of trust. She rewrapped the knife in its cloth, cradling it against her chest. I'll keep it safe, she said. His gaze softened. I know you will. There were no more words. There didn't need to be. Later that day, Clara placed the knife gently into the drawer by her bed, beside the flannel shirts Levi had given her in winter, and the worn-out gloves she had patched by the fireplace. Each item, a marker of change, of small battles won, not against the world, but within herself. That night, as she passed Levi on the porch, she didn't lower her eyes. She stood taller, steadier, her steps sure as she carried Ruthie in one arm and a basket in the other. Levi watched her go with a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Not quite a full expression, but enough to say everything he never had to. For once, Clara did not feel like the broken girl. She was someone who had earned a place in a quiet man's guarded world, someone who had turned silence into sanctuary. A month passed since the long night Clara sat beside Ruthie, her lullaby whispering life back into the child's fevered dreams. Winter's grip had finally loosened. The snow melted into thirsty earth, wildflowers peeked from under the frost-bitten grass, and the river behind the barn babbled louder with the thaw. Sunlight spilled over the Langston ranch, warming the wood of the fence Levi was mending. With his sleeves rolled up, he hammered in a nail, then paused, resting one hand on the post as he looked across the yard. Clara stood by the open kitchen window, a smudge of flour across her cheek. Ruthie was perched on a stool beside her, tiny hands deep in dough, her voice squealing with delight. Clara laughed, soft and real, guiding the girl's hands with her left one while anchoring the bowl against her side. A little to the left, June sat behind Clara, gently weaving her long hair into a braid. She worked with quiet focus, her small fingers surprisingly deft. Once the braid was done, she gave it a proud tug. Clara turned, smiled, and June, for the first time, smiled back. Caleb, holding a saddle nearly as tall as himself, stepped forward. He stood there, eyes serious, until Clara noticed him. I want to learn to ride like you, he said. Teach me? Clara looked at him, the boy who once wouldn't sit at the same table with her. She knelt slowly, brushing a hand over his arm. I'd love to, she said. Levi watched it all from the fence line. The hammer in his hand was forgotten. His eyes weren't cold today. They were warm, the way the soil softens for planting. When Clara turned toward him, catching his gaze, he did something he hadn't done in years. He smiled. It was small, hesitant, like a man who'd forgotten how, but it was real. Clara straightened, her heart fluttering. She didn't smile back, not immediately. Instead, she looked down at Ruthie, at June, at Caleb, and at the house behind them. She looked at the fence Levi was mending, at the field ready to bloom again. She looked at home. Later that evening, as the sky turned gold, Clara stood on the porch, arms crossed over her chest, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread. Levi came up beside her, his boots quiet on the worn boards. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Ruthie's laughter echoed through the open window. June's voice followed, calling her to clean up. Caleb stomped past, chasing the old hound with a rope in hand. Clara turned to Levi, just slightly. "Thank you," she said. "Not for anything specific, just everything." Levi didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. He handed it to her. She opened it slowly. It was a sketch, rough but tender. 4 figures, standing side by side. A tall man, a woman with 1 arm, and 3 children. Above it, in blocky handwriting, were the words, "The Langstons." Clara pressed the paper to her chest, eyes stinging. Levi didn't speak, didn't touch her. He simply stepped down the porch, walking toward the barn, the fading sun casting his long shadow behind him. Clara stood there for a long while, holding that piece of paper like it was the most fragile, precious thing she'd ever been given. Inside the house, above the hearth, hung a new frame. Inside it was another drawing, made by Ruthie. It showed a little girl holding hands with a tall, quiet woman. Underneath, Ruthie had scribbled, "Mama Clara," and no one had crossed it out. This was family, not the one you are born with, but the one you build, stitch by quiet stitch, until it holds strong enough to weather any storm. And in this corner of the wild, untamed West, they had found it. They had made it. A real home. If this story touched your heart, if you felt Clara's quiet courage, Levi's unspoken love, and the warmth of a family born not by blood, but by choice, then don't let the trail end here. Hit that like button to show your support for stories that remind us love doesn't always speak loud. Sometimes it just stays. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable journeys of devotion, redemption, and romance from the untamed heart of America. Because out here, where the winds whisper and the fences creak, love still rides strong. See you on the next ride.